Welcome to the second webinar discussion of our Spring 2022 Global Economic Governance Book Talk series hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is William Kring, and I'm the Executive Director of the GDP Center. I'm very excited to introduce Jeff Colgan today. Jeff is a brilliant scholar of international political economy who has inspired cutting-edge scholarship with the book we are going to discuss today, including my own dissertation, a project on which I was extremely fortunate to have him as an advisor and member of my committee. So, when and why does international order change? The global history of oil politics from World War I to the present can teach the international community much about world politics, climate change, and the international order in the 21st century. The largest peaceful transfer of wealth across borders in all of human history began with the oil crisis of 1973. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries turned the tables on the most powerful businesses on the planet, quadrupling the price of oil and shifting the global distribution of profits. It represented a huge shift in international order. Yet the textbook explanation for how world politics works, that the most powerful country sets up and sustains the rules of the international order after winning a major war, doesn't quite fit with these events. In his new book, Partial Hegemony, Oil Politics and International Order, Jeff Colgan explores how the international order operates in parts and often changes in peacetime, in contrast to the thinking of the international order as a single thing. Partial Hegemony offers lessons for leaders and analysts seeking to design new international governing arrangements and manage an array of pressing concerns, from climate change to nuclear proliferation. Jeff Colgan is the Richard Holbrooke Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University and Director of the Climate Solutions Lab at the Watson Institute of Public and International Affairs. His research focuses on international order, especially as it relates to energy and the environment. His research has been featured in International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, World Politics, Foreign Affairs, and I could go on. Prior to Brown University, he worked at McKinsey & Company, the World Bank, and American University. Today, Jeff joins us to discuss his new book. Jeff will present for about 30 minutes, at which point we will open the discussion. Before turning it over to Jeff, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box in your Zoom menu to ask your questions, but also please provide your name and affiliation so we can attribute the question to you. We will take questions after Jeff's remarks, but feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion so you don't forget them. Thank you, and now over to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's really a pleasure to be here, to be engaging with the Global Development Policy Center because of the great work that you, Bill, and others at the center have been doing. I want to share some slides with you today, so I'll just set that up right now, and hopefully you can all see that at this point. The book that I want to talk about is called Partial Hegemony, and it focuses on energy and international order. And it's hard, of course, to talk about a book like that at the moment without recognizing the elephant in the room, which is that we are seeing a war in Europe that has significant dimensions of energy politics and a challenge to international order. And so there's lots to say about how energy is a factor in that crisis, from Russia's Petro Aggression to Nord Stream 2 and the politics of pipelines and Europe's energy dependence. And I've written about those topics recently at Politico, Monkey Cage, but because the Russia-Ukraine crisis is on everyone's mind, let me start there, just talk for a couple of minutes about that. And then I'm going to zoom out to talk about a broader, more general framework for understanding international order and how it changes, right? And that's really the substance of the book itself. And of course, the book was written long before this crisis took place, but I think it actually holds up reasonably well, at least so far, in terms of how it helps us think about what's happening in Europe right now. So I'm going to go back to my first academic book, which I published in 2013, a book called Petro Aggression. And in that book, I investigated whether and why oil-producing petrostates get into more interstate conflict, into more wars than other kinds of states. And this was sort of an idea that people had anecdotally prior to my research on it. But I think I was the first to actually look at the statistics on this and say, okay, well, let's find out, are petrostates more conflict prone than other states? And what I found was that yes, petrostates do tend to get into conflict at higher rates, but 50% more often than non-petrostates. But within that group of petrostates, there's a huge amount of variation. That there are, in fact, lots of petrostates that are no more conflict prone than other kinds of state, in fact, maybe less so. But there's a small group of petrostates that are very aggressive and that are not just the targets of conflicts, as we might expect, because they are sitting on a pot of gold, essentially, that they have these very lucrative oil fields, but they are actually the ones starting conflicts. They're the ones initiating or instigating these conflicts. And the key here is a combination of two factors. The idea that there's oil wealth, which changes the domestic politics of a petrostate, and if there is a leader that has aggressive foreign policy preferences. And of course, not every petrostate has that, but the ones that do those tend to get into conflict a lot for the following basic reasons, right? So oil does a couple of things. One is that it reduces the domestic political constraints on the leader because it provides oil money, which in turn provides resources with which to buy off political opposition or to hire security services to oppress people. And we can see some of that happening in Russia over the last 20 years, but Russia is not unique in that respect at all, that many petrostates have these kinds of characteristics. And then, of course, oil money tends to fund a military war machine, providing kind of the resources to buy weapons and train troops. And then, in addition, oil money generates a financial cushion against economic sanctions of the kind that we are seeing in epic proportions right now. And so in that case, Putin's Russia sits within a category of petrostates that have had similarly aggressive foreign policies, and that category includes Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, who was long-running leader in Libya until, of course, he was overthrown and killed in 2011, and then Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which also instigated a number of conflicts. And so that is the sort of subject of my last book. I don't want to go into too great depth on it, but I'm happy to speak to it if people have questions in the Q&A. I'll say just a little bit more before pivoting towards the book I want to talk about today. And that really is about energy as the bedrock of the modern economy. And you know, energy is often sort of downplayed by being a relatively small percentage by dollar value of GDP, in the sense of, okay, that's only a slice of the economy, which is true, of course, but it's also kind of essential. And if you take that energy resource away, all of the other things, right, all of the other sectors of petrochemicals or transportation or services, heating, agriculture, all of those struggle to perform, or, you know, in the worst case scenario, are just unable to function altogether. And so energy is really easy to take for granted on a day-to-day basis until suddenly it isn't, right? If the supply of energy is cut off, then you have a real problem. And that's exactly the situation that Europe is confronting today, because Europe is dependent on roughly 40% of its natural gas consumption on Russian gas. And Russia, of course, might decide to turn off the taps and no longer export natural gas. It may not do that. Of course, it makes Russia, that would be costly for Russia since they make a lot of their money that way. But the real issue, of course, is that money can be stored relatively easily. Energy is harder to store. And if the politics in Europe don't get markedly better, then the real concern that policymakers ought to have is about next winter in Europe. Because if Russia were to turn off the taps on natural gas exports immediately today, that wouldn't actually necessarily mean that Europe didn't have any natural gas to consume for many weeks, right? There are supplies or inventories, there's various ways of making up for it for a while. But over the course of weeks or months, you start to face a real strategic balance problem. And independent analysis suggests that even with kind of fairly aggressive countermeasures that have been proposed by the International Energy Agency or the EU, even with those measures in place, Europe could face a shortfall of natural gas as early as next February, or even earlier if the winter's rough, because natural gas consumption is heavily dependent on how cold the winter is. And then Europe has a real problem. Then it has to choose between, say, shutting down major industries or letting people be cold in their homes. And you can imagine that the politics of that are not easy whatsoever. So the bottom line here is that the politics of petroleum are highly strategic, geostrategic and otherwise, and they can teach us something about international order more broadly. And the idea is, even if you didn't care about energy at all, and I hope today to convince you to care about it, but even if you didn't, we could learn how international order functions in other empirical domains, right? Over finance or over trade or over all kinds of other things by focusing on one sector and learning how it works. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the book itself, Partial Hegemony, and the starting point of the book is that largest peaceful transfer of wealth across borders in all of human history that Bill mentioned at the outset, which began in 1973. And up until that point, this small group of international oil companies known as the Seven Sisters controlled the vast majority of the world's oil reserves. Right after World War II, something like 85% of the world's oil reserves outside of the communist world. And that gave those companies enormous power over countries like Iran or Venezuela and allowed them to essentially control the government budget, the revenues of those countries. But then a little organization, which we now know as OPEC, helped its members turn the tables on what were, at the time, the most powerful companies on the planet. And that oil crisis, and of course in the West, it's known as the oil crisis. It's seen quite differently in the Persian Gulf. But the oil crisis of 1973 represented this massive shift in international order because it overturned the governing arrangements over oil. And I'm going to talk a lot about governing arrangements. These are the arrangements between states and non-state actors that govern kind of how the world works. One way to see that, the most sort of visible demonstration, if you will, of changing governing arrangements is to think about the price volatility over the last 150 years or so that oil has been a significant commodity. And so that's what this graph shows you. So it's not the price of oil, but rather the month-to-month change in the price of oil. And for most of that time, oil prices have been remarkably volatile, right? They go up and down a lot. That's the world we live in today. In fact, just a week ago, oil prices were up to $130 a barrel. Now they're back down to around $100 a barrel. I haven't checked this morning, so I don't know where they're at, but they're volatile. They change a lot. There was this period between roughly 1930 and 1970, where those 7 sister companies were an incredibly effective cartel in the sense that they controlled the price of oil, and they kept that price very steady and relatively moderate for large periods of time. In fact, during the 1960s, the price of oil didn't change by even a single penny per barrel for the entire decade. Right? And this is the kind of control over the price of oil that OPEC today can only dream of having, right? This was a period of really effective governing arrangements. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying that they were necessarily good arrangements, normatively good or bad, but they were effective, right? They controlled what they were trying to control. And that is something that we ought to pay attention to, because it turns out that we are a world in which we need some governing arrangements that are effective, and not just in oil, right? Not just in terms of energy prices. So we might learn more broadly from that. And so the question here for my book, really, and for what I want to share with you today is, what we want to know is, when is order effective, meaningful, and when is it durable versus breaking down? You know, when does it change? And the question of what international order actually is turns out to be a really vexed one. International relations scholars are really good at coming up with definitions. So we have, unfortunately, dozens and dozens of definitions of international order. It's a contested term. It's such a meaningful term that people want to define it in their own terms. I'm just going to simplify and borrow a really prominent definition from John Eikenberry, who thinks about international order as the governing arrangements among a group of states, including its fundamental rules, principles, and institutions. And the stakes here are really high, right? So international order is easy to take for granted, especially outside of war, but it really shapes our world, right? Governing arrangements allow us to eat imported foods. They allow us to invest our savings in global markets to get the best rates. It governs, what cities we're able to travel to on our vacations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of ways that international order is, in some sense, the core topic of my field, international relations. So what do we know about when it changes? Well, if you go to kind of an IR 101 course, we have a standard model of when international order and why it gets set up. And the basic model goes something like this. I'm going to simplify dramatically here, but there's basically a big war, something like World War II. And out of that war, the victor becomes a hegemon, meaning the leading state. And that hegemon is able to set the rules for the post-war. And then the rules and institutions of the post-war order last until the next big war, and the cycle repeats. Right? That's basically the gist of our default model of how international order works. And there are some disagreements, of course, among scholars about how exactly that works, and in particular, how effective a declining hegemon is at defending that order, whether the order needs it. But most of our big theories agree on the idea that hinge years like 1918 or 1815 or 1945, they're really crucial for how order changes. And not only that, but great powers are the ones that drive those changes. The problem here is that the events of 1973 that I just talked about really don't fit this theory well at all. And they don't fit for 3 different reasons, all right, in at least 3 different ways. One is that 1973 wasn't after a major power war, right? There was a war, but it was the Yom Kippur War, but it was sort of between minor powers. Second, it wasn't the great powers that drove the change that was happening. In fact, the United States actively resisted that change in 73. And number 3, it wasn't just the states that mattered. Right, that non-state actors like private firms and international organizations played really pivotal roles. And so recognizing that these changes that we saw in 1973 don't fit our standard model, we start to think about, well, what about other changes? Is this just sort of a one-off anomaly? And I'm just going to assert now, I won't try to defend it, but I would argue that, in fact, if you look at the post-war order, it's not a steady, constant thing. There are a regular set of significant changes in international order. And so going back to this idea of how and why international order changes, my intuition is to zoom in on this term of hegemon. What does that actually mean? And it turns out that international relations scholars are not very good at defining that term. Unlike international order, where there's like dozens and dozens of definitions, if you look for a definition of hegemon, you often get something like it's the leading state, full stop, right? And to the extent that people are willing to look further than that, scholars will often assert that a hegemon is the dominant state in respect to a whole lot of dimensions of international power, right? So it's supposed to be the strongest state militarily, it's the largest economy, it's the most technologically advanced, it's the state that has control over the flow of natural resources globally, same with capital flows, information flows, etc. And in all of this thinking, the idea is that a hegemon is kind of a binary thing. You're either the hegemon or you're not. And if you are the hegemon, then you have all of these dimensions of power. In reality, of course, a state could lead in some, but not all of these areas, right? And these different dimensions of power. And that's the situation that I describe as partial hegemony, right? And hence the title of the book. And so that seems like, okay, so once we break that down from being a pure hegemonic situation in theory to a more complicated partial hegemony story, what does that mean for international order? If we could just kind of plug it back into our theories and all would be well, then no problem. But in fact, it turns out to be much more complicated once we start thinking about hegemons in a non-binary sense. And part of the challenge that we have right now is that we can't even agree whether international order is changing, let alone why it's changing. Right? And if you look at journals like Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, the pages are full of debates among not just scholars, but also policymakers, where some people are saying, look, the international order is breaking apart, being disrupted, and others say, no, that's not what's happening, right? And this was happening, to be fair, I wrote this slide before the Ukraine crisis ever came along, right? So this is already happening, it has been happening for some time, particularly since 2016, where we had some real shocks to the system. And so some have argued, look, the international trade system has changed or is changing significantly, or the rise of China is really significant. International order, the liberal order, or the US-led order is, collapsing or under strain, etc. And others have said, listen, if you look back over the last 70 years, people are always talking about the liberal order as collapsing. But the fundamentals have not really changed. That in fact, the US continues to have military dominance. It has the largest number of significant allies in the world, and it continues to have dollar hegemony, right? Control over the financial system, which we are seeing in vivid display right now with respect to Russia. And so, no, the fundamentals have not changed. And this debate, in my view, is really intractable. It's in fact irresolvable so long as we continue to think about international order as a single thing, as a monolithic, right? The international order. The international order is the trouble, in my view. Instead, we're much better off to think in terms of subsystems, right? That international order actually operates as a kind of mass of overlapping, interacting subsystems. What do I mean by that? Well, I spent a lot of time in the book defining it, or not just defining, but theorizing it. And briefly, I would say subsystems are a collection of state and non-state actors that are kind of orbiting around a core question of governance, right? A single nucleus of governance. And the idea here, what distinguishes subsystems from, say, some other scholarly concepts like issue areas, is that subsystems have really just one question. Often we talk about sort of the environment as an issue area, or health or finance, and any of those are kind of broad topics, but they have multiple questions of governance involved. Whereas a subsystem is really just focused on one key question of governance, and that makes tractable the question of whether it's changing or not changing in a better analytic way. And I'll say more about that in just an example. I'm going to walk through an example. But stay with me for a moment. If we accept this idea that international order is this mass of different subsystems, then it opens us up to a new possibility, that in fact international order isn't linked as a single monolithic thing that is depends on a hegemon, but instead change within those systems might be driven by the conditions that are specific to that subsystem. And some subsystems are changing while others are not changing all the time, and not just after big wars, right? That you have this constant process of change and continuity that's going on all the time in the world. And it's only possible to think about that when you see international order as a sum of a lot of different parts rather than as a single block. Okay, so I'm going to dive deep into oil politics, and the book spends 100 years, spends time reviewing 100 years of global oil politics. And it does so in terms of two core subsystems, right? So to make sense of this centuries worth of history, I focus on just two core subsystems. One is about oil production. And the core question of governance at the heart of that is how much oil to produce and where to produce it. And that's the question that OPEC today spends a lot of time thinking about. So do the actors in Texas and Russia and a whole lot of other places. And so there's a whole collection of different actors that are interacting around that core question. Historically, the Seven Sisters were prominent actors in this subsystem. And it matters a ton, of course, how much supply gets produced, because that tends to impact the price of oil in really dramatic ways, especially when we're talking about the fundamentals over time periods of months and years rather than on a kind of day-to-day time. That subsystem around oil politics is so important. It makes the headlines so frequently, right? But what's the price of oil and why is it going up or down? That often people get a little bit too focused on it. They think about it as the subsystem, that's what oil politics is really all about. And in fact, that's what much of the scholarship in international political economy in the 1970s got focused on, right? People got dazzled by what was happening, the big changes in oil production politics. But there is a second subsystem that, to a certain extent, scholars of IPE have paid less attention to, but scholars of international relations, those who study security, have paid a lot more attention to, which is about oil security. And the core question here is, how will oil fields be distributed around the world according to political jurisdiction or sovereignty? Who has sovereignty over what oil fields is the core question. And this question seems like maybe sort of like a relatively minor thing, except that when you look at history, wars have been fought over this question. It matters a lot how oil gets distributed and who has control over the oil fields. This was most vividly demonstrated in 1990 when Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait and actually pushed the Iraqi army over the border into Saudi Arabia and started to threaten some of the Saudi oil fields as well. And this presented the US and its allies, especially Britain, with a real conundrum, real challenge, and they started thinking hard about, well, could they stand this? Is this something that would be something they could turn a blind eye to? And very quickly, they came to the answer, no. And the reason was although it got dressed up later for public relations perspectives about norms of sovereignty and world order and all of those good things. If you look at the minutes of the meetings of the National Security Council immediately after the invasion, the core question on the minds of the key US policymakers, what they were thinking about was oil, right? Oil politics and the threat that Saddam Hussein could become a quasi-monopolist over the global oil system. And that was the concern that the United States simply could not set aside. And so while countries in, say, sub-Saharan Africa might go to war and the United States could pay relatively little attention to it, that was not the case in the Persian Gulf. And the US rallied a large international coalition to push back Iraq out of Kuwait, as we know. And so part of this subsystem, the oil security subsystem, has as its backbone what are known as oil for security deals, right? And the details of these deals vary from place to place and over time, but the basic gist of it is that there is an external protector. Today, it's the United States. In the past, it was the United Kingdom that offers military security and protection to petrostates that provide, in exchange, some sort of economic benefits related to oil. 60 or 70 years ago, it was the actual physical oil that would flow to these external protectors. Today, it's actually a little more complicated. It's sort of a basket of other economic benefits, but they're linked to oil. And so those oil for security deals have been a key part of Middle East politics for the last 60 or 70 years, and they've had a kind of degree of continuity that is quite striking. And the key event that I see as disrupting this 100 years of oil politics really has to do with European decolonization in the mid-20th century, right? And we can date it to different periods, but roughly from 1945 to 1970 or so was this period where European empires were rolled back, sometimes somewhat voluntarily, sometimes quite violently. But that decolonization had a dramatic impact on these two subsystems, and they had very different impacts. So let me just say a word about that. If you go back in time to a period where empires were still very much a core feature of world politics, and they were in fact the largest and dominant forms of polities in the world, right? Empires ruled much of the world at that point. Then you have these two subsystems interacting quite closely together. You have a set of Anglo-American oil companies, the Seven Sisters, that controlled the price of oil, and they were able to effectively punish other actors that were not participating in the system that they benefited from. And so, for instance, if the host governments, right, the governments of petrostates like Iran or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia decided that they wanted different terms, a different form of international order, well, then in that case, they faced real punishments by other players in the system, not just the oil companies, but also the governments of the home governments of those companies. And so this was vividly demonstrated in Iran in the 1950s. The man you see on the left here is Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, who wanted to nationalize the Iranian oil sector that at that time was run by a British oil company. We now call it BP, but at the time it had a different name. And he nationalized the oil sector in 1951. And immediately the oil companies arranged an economic boycott on Iranian oil. And so they lowered the production of Iranian oil and then compensated for the missing oil by increasing their production in places like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia benefited economically, financially from this arrangement, so they were somewhat pleased by the outcome. And that piled on a lot of economic pressure to Iran, created some turmoil and political dissent. which in 1953, the CIA and MI6 took advantage of and arranged for a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, and the Shah was returned to political power. And practically his first act was to hand the Iranian oil sector back over to BP and a set of other oil companies, right, the Seven Sisters. And so that kind of punishment is the kind of thing that was part and parcel to the international order that I talked about before, which controlled that price of oil so effectively. Not very nice, but effective. So what happened? Why did that system change? Well, decolonization was crucial to this story. It really upended the Seven Sisters cartel because, in a sense, prior to decolonization, there was no nation in many of the oil-producing territories to actually do the nationalizing. Suddenly there was with decolonization, and many of those countries wanted to do it. They couldn't do it right away, and they had to wait until the early 1970s when market conditions changed. The global oil market went from a loose market, meaning abundant supply, to a tight market with not enough supply. And suddenly the bargaining leverage that those petrostates had was considerably more. And so the Seven Sisters were able to constrain their supply quite effectively. Today, that's not the case. OPEC does not have the same kind of enforcement mechanisms that the Seven Sisters does. And so in the book, I did some analysis about how effectively OPEC actually operates. And the bottom line is they don't operate very effectively at all. They cheat 96% of the time on their quotas when they actually have quotas. And the real market power within OPEC really comes from Saudi Arabia, its key member, rather than the institution in Vienna. In terms of OPEC itself, the institution doesn't amplify the market power that its members have. It's more like a press secretary, right? And so we listen to OPEC in the same way we listen to the press secretary of the President of the United States, but it's not because the press secretary themselves has much of much authority or power. I realize I'm running short on time, so I'm going to just jump a little bit faster, but I will just say here, the bottom line is that decolonization changed one of these subsystems quite dramatically, right? It upended the oil production subsystem, but it largely left intact the other subsystem. The oil for security deals continued on and continue to play a major role in Middle East politics today. And so the US continues to protect Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and UAE and Qatar, et cetera, today. That's not to say that there were no changes in the subsystem. There were, because there used to be some oil for security deals with countries like Iran, which ultimately changed, of course, when there were domestic revolutions there. But the core, the backbone of that system has remained much more consistent than the dramatic change we saw in the oil production subsystem in the 1970s. So treating order as a monolith in the sort of traditional IR way, right, the international order, would leave you blind to that distinction of one subsystem changing and the other one not. And so that's part of the theoretical punch that I offer in this book, is to say, hey, look, seeing in subsystems is better. It allows us to see variation that we would otherwise be blind. That, of course, still leaves us back with that central IR question about how and when does international order change. In the theory I present, in the book, I present a theory about how that works, which I do not have time to go over today, but this is my second last slide. I'll just say a word about how this operates. The theory really depends on two core explanatory variables. One is the net benefits that participants of an international order within a given subsystem receive from that order, right? So do they like the order? Do they get something out of it? If they do, they're more likely to want to keep the existing arrangements. The other variable that matters is the extent to which powerful actors are able to punish actors who do not comply with the international order. And that variable, the degree to which there's real punishment for non-compliance, I think has been underappreciated in international political economy, in particular by the school of liberal institutionalism in IR. And we're seeing kind of a vivid display of that right now in real time, right? Where we see Russia is not complying with the established order that is enshrined in the UN Charter of territorial sovereignty, respect for territorial sovereignty. And so the US and the Europeans and others are responding to Russia's non-compliance with a very strong set of economic sanctions. Whether those sanctions will be sufficient to change Russia's behavior, nobody knows. And so that outcome is quite uncertain. But what's really strange about the current situation really is that it's Russia, which is a great power country, that is being punished. Typically, these punishments are applied to weaker countries that are kind of nudged back into the international order. And that's one of the ways in which international order is maintained over time. I emphasize it so strongly because as we start to think about American power waning in certain respects, not all respects, but certain respects, we might be blind to just how much those punishments matter. And we sort of take for granted that, yeah, okay, you know, everybody likes our system. It works well. And, you know, we can all voluntarily participate in it. In fact, if you look over history, many previous hegemons, like the British Empire, were surprised to discover that at the end of their period of dominance, that in fact, many of the subordinate actors were not too pleased with it. They were not voluntarily cooperating. They had only been cooperating all along because they had been coerced into it. And so British businesses in Africa were suddenly thrown out of Africa when decolonization occurred, and they were shocked that this happened, not realizing that the threat of punishments for noncompliance had been a core part of what was happening all along. Bottom line here is that international governing arrangements only work, they're only durable under some political conditions. And so we can learn from them. And we can learn from the oil sector about how governing arrangements apply in other areas as well. And the strategy of this book is to move from the particular, oil politics, to the general, right, the 30,000 foot of IR theory, and then back to specific subject matters, including the one that is kind of nearest and dearest to my heart, which is climate change. And chapter 7 of the book is devoted to climate change. I haven't said a word about it up until this point. I'm happy to if you're interested. But that, if you think about an area where we need effective governing arrangements, that is the area where our need is perhaps the greatest, right? Where we face the most significant global challenge. I'm going to stop there and welcome any questions that you have or reactions, Bill, that you want to offer. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to give everyone just a second to get their questions populated in the Q&A box. While that happens, I'm going to selfishly plug something that I forgot to at the beginning, which is I'd like everyone to who's interested to navigate to our homepage for the GDP Center and register for our annual Paul Streeton lecture next week. The keynote speaker is Danny Roderick. I'll be in person and hybrid. And Danny will be giving a lecture on the future development strategy. So it's Wednesday, March 23rd at 4 p.m. We have a couple questions here to kick things off. Jeff, if it's okay with you, I'll give you, maybe two or three at a time, and then give you some time to respond. As the first question is from Rebecca Ray, a senior academic researcher here at the GDP Center. And Rebecca says, thanks for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. If you wouldn't mind looking in your crystal ball for a moment, which I see behind you, how might these principles apply in the 21st century as the world shifts towards new sources of energy? Then we have a question from Jerry Harris. Jerry asks from the Global Studies Association, there's a huge amount of cross-border investments in oil production in which both private and state entities combine their interest in various combinations. How does this cross-cut nationally based politics? Why don't we start off with those two?
Well, those are terrific questions. Thank you so much for them. I'll start with Rebecca's. My crystal ball is as cloudy as everyone else's, unfortunately, but I have a couple of thoughts about how this matters a lot for the clean energy transition, right? So two thoughts. One is about the degree to which the world takes decarbonization seriously is going to affect the oil subsystem quite dramatically, of course, right? And start with this thought. We don't know how seriously the world is going to decarbonize. We've talked a good game for 20 or 30 years, but in that time, global emissions continue to rise. And so I would love to say that, yes, we're going to plateau and start to descending anytime soon. I'm hopeful to that, and I work towards that world. But I think the sort of hard-nosed realist in me would say, look, we have to think seriously about a world where governments may or may not actually act in a strong way to make that world happen. Even if they do, oil is likely to decline only slowly, right? In the next 10 to 20 years, oil is going to be a major part of our world because electric vehicles are still, at the moment, only a small fraction of new vehicles sold. And even if there were 100% of new vehicles sold, it takes quite a long time for the world's car fleet, and let alone the airplane fleet and the shipping fleet to turn over to alternative fuels. And so oil is king for transportation fuels, and it probably will remain king for quite some time. Having said that, I think investors in particular are starting to realize that the time horizons for big oil projects and natural gas projects, and certainly coal projects, is shrinking. That they should start thinking in terms of 10 to 20 years rather than 30 or 40 or 50 years, which has been the habit of the fossil fuel industry over the last century. And it's not just investors that are starting to think about that. It's also petrostate governments. They are starting to realize that these oil for security deals, well, guess what? They depend on oil. And if oil consumption starts to wane, then maybe their security guarantee also starts to wane. And that has potentially really significant consequences. That's actually what I'm doing my next research project on, is sort of the geopolitics of how petrostates are thinking about that. It's worth saying that the group of oil producers might shrink to the extent that we reduce our oil demand, but it's going to shrink unevenly, right? It's not necessarily going to be, the Saudi Arabias of the world probably don't need to worry a great deal because they have the low cost production supply, right? Their oil is really cheap. You can stick a straw in the ground and you get oil, more or less. That's very different from, say, Venezuela or Canada, where the oil production costs are much higher. And so in a sort of economically rational world, we might expect to see them disappear first. Russia's recent actions in Ukraine kind of complicate that story because, yeah, Russia's oil is really cheap to produce, but they become so geopolitically toxic that maybe their oil sector will be one of the ones to disappear as well. We'll see. There's lots more to say on that. I didn't even get to the second half of my answer, but I want to get to Jerry's question as well. You're absolutely right that there's kind of national oil companies are kind of the dominant actor in the global oil sector, right? So Saudi Aramco is a national oil company. It's owned by the king of Saudi Arabia. And those companies are really significant because they're not just economic actors, they're also political actors. And so to the extent that petrostates can stay out of politics or to remain at least kind of under the radar and nominally acceptable to the powerful actors in the scene, then that doesn't generate major deviations from what economic theory would suggest. Russia is giving us a real-time display of what happens when they do, right? Where Gazprom and Rosneft are not just oil companies and natural gas companies, they're also major geopolitical actors, and suddenly the whole picture looks different. It's worth saying too that, you know, when we think about the swing producer of oil, right? So often there's pressure on the president of the United States to do something about high gasoline prices or high oil prices, and recognizing the difference in the ownership structure of different oil sectors around the world is really important. Where the Saudi king can say to Saudi Aramco, pump more oil, the president of the United States can't do that, right? He doesn't own the oil sector. He doesn't own the oil companies. This is a private set of companies, and so they're going to do what's in their interest to do. And you can see some of that struggle just in the last couple of weeks as the Biden team has tried to lean on the oil companies to produce more, and with only mixed success, I would say, at best. The variation in the ownership structure does certainly matter to the geopolitics and the responsiveness of the global system to oil price pressures. Thanks, Jerry, for the question.
Great, thank you. We'll do one more round of questions. The first one is from Shamiran Mako. Thank you for being with us at BU today, Jeff. This was insightful. Recently, Saudi Arabia announced it was considering selling oil in the Chinese yuan. Is this a mere threat, or could this actually materialize? And can you speak a bit to the reverberating effects this could have globally? And then Monte Aguirre asks you to reflect on the particulars that are important to consider with where some oil is produced from in indigenous territories, and the potential risk of impacting areas of high biodiversity and what that means for the future of oil in the international system. And then I would just ask you, we've seen this rise of populism and a rejection, certainly from some, even in the United States, of the international order itself. And we know historically that order, as you mentioned, gets established around these critical junctures of coming out of wars. And so can you conceive of a scenario where the international order is reaffirmed or a new order is established that kind of crystallizes around some of these subsystems and alternatives that some scholars have looked at without a war? And what might that look like based on your theory? What insights can that offer? So those would be the last round of questions. The floor is yours, Jeff. Great, thanks so much, Bill. I absolutely can imagine that. So let me start with your question, because I think in a sense that's what 1973 is a major shift in international order without a major power war, and this is, in my view, a good thing, because sometimes international order needs to change, right? That we want it to change, and none more so than in the topic of climate change, right? We need to shift our set of governing arrangements because they're killing us. They're actually, crushing the planet's long-term sustainability, and we need to have a shift for that. And if we think about international order as only changing when there's a big major power war, well, that's pretty depressing in terms of what we can expect for climate change, right? We hope that we don't have to go to war, especially go to war with China, to make sure that China's emissions start to come down. So yes, I think it's possible. Historically, there is evidence that it happens, and I have some suggestions in the book about how to make that happen, how to think about a different kind of international trade system that is supportive of pro-climate policy, right? So to use carbon tariffs, to use a climate club, to start providing those incentives for shifting our economic system. But to your point, I mean, wars focus the mind like nothing else, right? And usually these shifts in
international order, yes, they're more probably more probable right after wars, even if that's not the only time when they happen. My point is just that there are other types of crises that also tend to cause these shifts, right? So in 1973, it was an economic crisis. In the last 2 years, we've had a pandemic, and that kind of crisis might have a similar set of shifts, at least in some subsystems, not very many of them, but some of them. To come back to the question about Saudi Arabia's currency and what currency will it sell in oil in, it's a great question. I think one of the fact that Saudi Arabia and other petrostates price their oil in dollars is part of what I talked about before, the sort of oil for security deals. That's part of the economic benefits that Saudi Arabia offers to the United States, is it reinforces the dollar hegemony of the global oil system, right? Not just of the oil system, but of the whole global financial system, is by saying, okay, look, we're going to price all of our oil in dollars. That makes dollars sort of the central currency. It's not just oil that does that, but it's sort of one of the supports. And so when Saudi Arabia starts to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore, we should keep a couple of things in mind. One is that the US-Saudi relationship has weathered a lot of storms, and this kind of friction in the relationship is part of the norm over the last 75 years. There's frequently friction, but it is an indication of friction. And the timing is notable given what's happening in the world right now. And I think we should take seriously the idea that someday this might happen. I don't think that the actual actions that Saudi Arabia has announced just this week are going to undermine global dollar hegemony. And what they announced is really fairly small move. They're going to be allowing themselves to pay workers in yuan, but most of their sales are really still going to be in dollars. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be as dismissive as some people are, and I've taken some heat for this on Twitter. People are saying, "Oh, look, this is we've heard this before from Saudis, no big deal." And I would just remind Americans that we are subject to the same blind spots that, say, were relevant for Germany, when for 40 years the United States had been warning Europeans and Germans in particular that Russian natural gas dependence might come back to bite them. And maybe they shouldn't build Nord Stream 2 or even Nord Stream 1 or any of the pipelines going way back into the 1980s when it was the Soviet Union. And Europeans have been hearing this for so long that they got comfortable saying, look, American warnings, whatever, you guys have your own view on this. And they were right for a long time until suddenly they weren't right. And suddenly they realized actually Russian natural gas dependence is a problem. And we too should be thinking about that exact same issue with respect to dollar hegemony. Yes, the US dollar has weathered a lot of problems, a lot of threats over the years, but that doesn't mean that that hegemony is inherently permanent for all time. Eventually, it may face real threats. And now I'm trending into Bill's territory much more than my own, so maybe I should pause at this point.
Yeah, great. One last question that came in, Jeff, from Kevin was, please share your thoughts on the lessons from OPEC governance potentially for climate governance. How could a small coalition of the willing put together an OPEC-like regime on climate change, given the public good nature of stable climate and the free rider problem and leakage? If developing country emitters don't join, right, we struggle to solve the problem. Other developing countries joining or not, they could be damaged by being cut off from in-club markets, even though they didn't cause the problem. So I'll leave you with that question, and then we'll wrap up.
Great. It's a great question, and thank you, Kevin, for it. My own preferred approach is to think about the major economies and the major emitters as forming a small club. I think it's at this point too hard to try to work within a 192 country system. We should be thinking about trying to get first Europe and the US on the same page, and then ultimately Europe, US, and China. If we could get those three economies to agree on some minimum thresholds for the kinds of pro-climate policy that is minimally acceptable, whether that's a carbon tax at a certain price or a certain kind of green industrial policy or regulations, what have you. I don't know how the equivalence matching works, but I do think that some sort of minimum threshold of pro-climate policy is what we need to establish among those three groups, right? China, the US, and Europe. And that leaves OPEC kind of out of the picture for now, and I'm okay with that, right? That they're going to do what they do in response to the major economies. So start with the major emitters, start to see some progress there, and then allow those major emitters to protect their manufacturing competitive advantage with some form of carbon tariff. Because if we say that the global south is going to be able to undermine US producers, it's never going to get through the US Senate. And the US Senate has been exceptionally clear on this, right? For, back to the Kyoto Protocol, the reason why it was voted down was all about the fact that the US economy, US politicians did not want the US economy to bear the costs of dealing with climate change in a way that put US manufacturers at a competitive disadvantage. And so if we can take that problem away, we might be able to make progress on the domestic politics of actually having a real climate policy. And I will note just in my last 20 seconds here that I am encouraged to see Republican policymakers for the first time really starting to talk seriously about a carbon tariff. And so there's maybe some space opening up just in the last couple of weeks of some bipartisan movement on carbon tariffs as a way to kind of lay the groundwork for a more effective pro-climate policy in the United States. We'll see whether that bears out. Hope springs eternal. But thank you, Kevin, for that question. And apologies to Monty that I didn't get to answer yours.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined in the discussion. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share a link in the chat. To receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to receive updates from the Global Economic Governance Initiative. There'll also be a link in the chat for that. So lots of links to take down. But thank you all. Thank you, Jeff. And we'll see you all next time.
Terrific. Thanks, Bill.